The creek ran low that August, the way it always did before the first frost crept down from the bighorns, and she knelt at its edge with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, watching the water slide dark and slow over stones the color of old boot leather. It had not always looked like that. 3 years back, when they first drove their wagon onto this quarter section and staked their claim with trembling hope more than certainty, the creek had run clear enough to see her own reflection in it. Now it ran the color of strong tea, and the bank itself, once pale clay, had turned a deep chestnut brown that stained her hands whenever she touched it. She did not yet know what to make of it. The tanning mill 2 miles upstream had been dumping its spent bark for 2 summers running. Barrel after barrel of the crushed oak hide tanners no longer wanted, rolled down the slope and left to wash into the current whenever the rains came. At first it had seemed a nuisance only, a smell of vinegar and old leather drifting on the wind some mornings, but the mulch had piled thick along their fence line now, and the ground beneath it had gone soft and strange, darker than any soil either of them had ever farmed. Her husband stood a little way off, hat pushed back, studying the same stretch of bank with the flat, tired look of a man doing arithmetic he did not like the answer to. He had built this place with his own hands, the low cabin, the sod-roofed barn, the fence they'd strung post by post their first hard winter, and he did not care for anything that threatened to undo that work. That was when the assessor's buggy came rattling down the wagon track, raising dust even though the ground was damp from yesterday's rain. The man who climbed down was stern and thin-lipped, his coat too fine for creek mud, and he did not waste time on pleasantries. He walked the bank with his boots sinking an inch into the blackened earth, made a small sound of disgust, and crouched to rub a pinch of it between his fingers, as though testing spoiled flour. "Ruined," he said, straightening, wiping his hand on his trouser leg. "Tannins poisoned this ground clean through. I'll have to mark it down in the county book. Can't assess wasted land the same as good pasture." She felt her husband go still beside her, the way he always did when trouble arrived that could not be fixed with a hammer or a plow. "It's only bark, Mr. Whitfield," he said carefully. "Same soil underneath." The assessor only shook his head, climbed back into his buggy, and rattled off toward the county road, leaving behind a silence thick as the mulch itself. She looked down at the dark, tannin-stained earth beneath her boots, and for the first time wondered, quietly, uncertainly, whether the ground was truly ruined at all, or whether it was only waiting to be understood. That evening, with supper waiting cold on the stove, they walked the bank together, the dog trotting ahead and sniffing at the blackened earth as though it too had questions. The light was going amber and low over the ridge, and the creek moved slow and dark beneath the willows, carrying the faint, bitter smell of bark that had become as familiar to them as smoke or rain. She had thought little of it these 2 years. That smell, it was simply the smell of the tannery upstream doing its work, the smell of barrels rolling down and spilling their spent contents along the water's edge. But walking it now, with the assessor's words still sitting heavy in her chest, she found herself studying the ground the way a body studies a stranger's face, looking for what she had missed. He crouched first, the way the assessor had, but slower, less certain, more like a man greeting something than judging it. He pressed his palm flat against the mud and went quiet. "Come feel this," he said. She knelt beside him, her skirt darkening at the hem, and pushed her fingers into the bark-mulched earth. It gave easily, softer than she expected, almost like risen dough left too long by the fire. And it was warm, not warm as though the sun had baked it, for the willows kept this stretch shaded most of the day, but warm from somewhere beneath, a low, steady heat that seemed to rise up through her fingers and into her wrist. "That's peculiar," she said softly. "It is." He turned a handful over, watching it crumble dark and rich between his fingers, nothing like the pale, cracked clay farther up the slope where their potatoes had struggled all summer. Feels near like the compost heap behind the barn. All that heat comes from things breaking down, working themselves into something new. You think the bark's rotting into the soil rather than ruining it. I don't know what I think. He sat back on his heels, brushing his hand against his trouser leg, though he did not seem eager to rid himself of the mud entirely. Whitfield's no fool about county ledgers, but he's no farmer either. He looked at black dirt and called it poison because it wasn't the color he expected. Petunia lowed from the direction of the barn, impatient for her evening feeding, and Barley barked once in answer before returning to sniff along the bank, tail low and curious. Overhead, the first cold stars were showing themselves above the ridge, a reminder that autumn's mercy would not last forever, that whatever they meant to plant, they would need to plant it soon or lose the season altogether. She looked at the dark earth cupped in her husband's palm, warm and strange and unlike anything the assessor had named it, and felt something quiet stir in her. Not quite hope, not yet, but the small, patient beginning of a question that would not let itself be dismissed. They did not speak of it again that night, but the question followed them into the cabin, sat with them through supper, and lingered even as she banked the fire and he checked the latch on the barn door twice, the way he always did when his mind was elsewhere. By morning, the frost had not yet come, though its promise hung thin and sharp in the air, and he stood at the edge of the creek bank with a burlap sack of turnip seed in one hand and a paper twist of carrot seed in the other, looking at the dark mud as a man might look at a door he was not certain led anywhere good. "It's late for planting," he said, more to himself than to her. "It's later for doing nothing," she answered, and that seemed to settle something in him, because he knelt down without further discussion and began to work the soil with his fingers, testing its give, its warmth, the strange looseness of it compared to the packed clay farther up the field. She fetched her ledger from the cabin, the same one she used to record the weather, the milk yield, the price of nails at the mercantile, and found a fresh page, dating it carefully at the top. She wrote down the date, the weather, the condition of the ground, and then, because it seemed important somehow, the exact place along the bank where he meant to plant, marking it by the crooked willow that leaned out over the water. He worked in silence for a while, turning the mud with the edge of a hoe, breaking apart the largest clumps of bark so the seed would have something like proper contact with the earth beneath. Barley trotted along beside him, nosing at the overturned soil, sneezing once when the sharp tannic smell rose too close to his nose, then losing interest and wandering off toward the willow roots. "If this doesn't take," Franklin said, not looking up, "we'll have lost the seed and the ground both, and Whitfield will have been right all along. If it doesn't take," she said, "we'll know something we didn't know before. That's not nothing, even in a hard year." He gave her a look then, tired but softened at the edges, and went back to his planting, dropping the turnip seed in careful rows, tamping the mud down with the flat of his palm, moving down the row to the carrots with the same slow patience. She followed behind him, noting in her ledger the number of paces between rows, the depth of each furrow, the way the bark seemed to hold moisture longer than the clay soil did, darkening her fingers where she touched it to test. By the time the sun dropped low enough to gild the ridge, the row was finished, a thin, unremarkable line of disturbed earth along a bank the county had already condemned in ink. Neither of them said what they were hoping for. But that evening, before she closed her ledger, she wrote one line beneath the day's entry, small and careful. "We shall see what comes of waiting." The days that followed held no drama at all, and that was its own kind of trial. Each morning she rose before the light fully broke, pulled her shawl tight against the chill that had crept in overnight, and went to the barn to milk the cow, her hands finding the familiar rhythm while her mind wandered down to the creek bank. She did not go and look. She told herself there was no sense in looking. Nothing worth seeing could appear in 3 days, or 5, or even a week, but she found her feet carrying her that way regardless, and each time the same thin brown line of disturbed earth greeted her, unchanged, giving nothing back. He kept himself busy with the fence along the north pasture, where 2 posts had rotted through at the base and needed replacing before the ground froze hard enough to fight him. It was honest work, the kind that asked nothing of hope, and he seemed grateful for it. She noticed he lingered over each post longer than necessary, testing it with more force than the task required, as though the effort of driving something solid into the earth might steady something else in him that had gone loose and uncertain. The dog took to lying near the creek bank in the thin afternoon sun, and she found herself watching him instead of the ground, half convinced that if anything stirred beneath the mud, he would know it before she did. He never did anything but sleep. At supper they spoke of small things, a loose shingle on the roof, whether the cow's feed would last through the colder months, a letter that had not come from her sister in Cheyenne. Neither of them mentioned the row of seed by name, though it sat between them at the table as surely as the bread did. She caught him once, staring past her shoulder toward the window that faced the creek, and she did not ask what he was thinking, because she already knew. On the 5th evening, checking her ledger by lamplight, she found herself rereading the entries from the planting day, searching the numbers for some reassurance the numbers could not give. The paces between rows were correct. The depth of the furrows was correct. There was nothing in the record to explain what the ground would or would not do, and that absence unsettled her more than any bad omen might have. "It's early yet," he said one night, more to himself than to her, as he banked the fire before bed. "It is," she agreed, though she heard in her own voice the same thin doubt she heard in his. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the bank, and the creek ran on as it always had, indifferent to whatever waited, or did not wait, beneath its darkened mud. On the 6th morning she went out, before the coffee had finished boiling, drawn by nothing she could name, only a restlessness that had settled into her chest overnight and would not let her lie still. The dog trotted ahead of her down the slope, nose low, tail loose, and she followed him past the fence line to the place where the dark row lay along the creek. She stopped so suddenly that he circled back to see what had halted her. The ground had broken. Not in one place, but in a dozen, small green points pushing up through the blackened mud in a ragged, eager line, as if the row had decided overnight to answer every question she had been too afraid to ask aloud. She crouched and touched one with the tip of her finger, half expecting it to be some trick of the early light, some trailing weed she was mistaking for what she wanted to see. It was not a weed. It was the unmistakable curl of a young turnip leaf, and beside it another, and beside that another, thicker and greener than anything she had seen come up in the garden proper. She called for him before she had decided to call, and he came down from the barn still buttoning his coat, and when he reached her side he went as still as she had gone. "That's 4 days early," he said, "if it's a day." "It's more than early," she said. "Look how thick they stand. Look at the color of them." They walked the row together, slow, careful not to set a boot too near the tender shoots, and everywhere they looked the same thing met them, seedlings standing taller than their neighbors in the garden proper, a deeper green that seemed almost to hold a shine in the morning light, as though the dark mud beneath them had lent them some of its own strange richness. Petunia lowed from the barn, wanting her milking, and neither of them moved to answer her for a long moment, caught instead in a silence that was not quite belief and not quite doubt, but something suspended between the two. "It could be the warmth of the bark holding through the night," he offered, feeling for an explanation the way a man feels for a foothold on unfamiliar rock. Dark ground draws heat. Might be nothing more than that. "It might be," she said, though she did not believe this time that it was nothing more than that. She had kept a garden long enough to know the ordinary pace of things, and this was not the ordinary pace. This was something else, something the mud had been withholding all these long, silent days while they waited and doubted and refused to speak its name at the table. She did not write triumph into her ledger that evening. She wrote only the count of shoots, the height in her thumb's measure, the color as best her words could hold it, small, careful facts, the only kind she trusted yet. But when she blew out the lamp, she found her hand resting on his sleeve in the dark, and neither of them spoke of turnips, and neither of them needed to. 3 days later he could no longer keep his hands from the ground. He had told himself he would wait for the almanac's marked date, the one his father had taught him to trust above all instinct, but the leaves above the mud had grown so broad and dark that patience felt less like virtue and more like cowardice. Before first light, while the dog stretched and yawned against the porch post, and the cow lowed once for her morning feed, he took the spade down to the creek bank alone. He chose the smallest plant, reasoning that if disappointment waited beneath the soil, better it wait in the least of his hopes than the greatest. He worked the spade in a slow circle, the way she had taught him when tending her mother's onions years before, easing rather than forcing, letting the earth surrender its secret instead of tearing it free. What came up out of the dark mulch stopped his breath entirely. The turnip filled his palm and spilled over both edges of it, pale and heavy, its skin smooth and unblemished, no sign of the beetle scarring that pocked every root pulled from the Hendricks field or the Larsons' garden 2 miles east. He turned it in his hands the way a man turns a coin he suspects might be counterfeit, searching for some flaw that would restore the world to its expected order. He found none. He carried it back to the cabin cradled against his chest, like something that might break, and set it on the table without a word, watching her face instead of the vegetable itself, wanting to see whether her eyes would tell him he had lost his senses or found something real. She did not speak at first either. She lifted it, weighed it against the memory of every turnip she had ever pulled from ordinary ground, and set it down again with the particular care of a woman handling church silver. "Twice," she said finally, "near twice the size of anything from the Westfield." "Near twice," he agreed, and heard his own voice come out unsteady, as though the number itself were a kind of confession. Barley nosed at the turnip and sneezed at the sharp, bitter smell still clinging to its skin, the same dark tang that clung to the mud along the whole bank, and backed away without further interest, which struck them both in that moment as its own kind of testimony. Even the dog seemed to know there was something in that bitterness the beetles could not abide. They stood over the table a long while, the lamp between them throwing its small circle of light across the swollen root, and neither one reached yet for words like fortune or answer, because such words felt too large, too final, for a discovery still trembling on the edge of belief. But something had shifted between them nonetheless, a quiet certainty settling where doubt had lived, and when he finally spoke, it was not to explain the size away, but to ask, softly, whether there might be more like it still waiting in the dark. They went out again before first light, lanterns swinging between them, and found the answer already waiting in the dirt, 3 more roots, plump and pale-shouldered, pushed up through the bark-blackened mud as if the earth itself had been holding them in reserve. She knelt and worked her fingers gently around the nearest, easing it free the way she might lift a sleeping child, and when it came loose, whole, and heavy in her palm, she laughed once, softly, before catching herself, as though laughter were too ordinary a sound for what she was holding. It was later that morning, walking the fence line with a basket balanced on her hip, that she noticed the neighboring field beyond the rail, old Hendrix's turnip rows, the leaves there chewed to lace, black beetles crawling thick along the stems, the whole patch looking as though a fire had passed low over it and left only ruin. She stood a long moment, studying the contrast, their own patch green and full and undisturbed, not a single beetle working its way along the bark-darkened rows, while just a few dozen yards off, an entire crop was being eaten down to nothing. She said little of it at first, only turned the thought over as she walked back, and by the time she reached the cabin, she had already half formed the notion, though she did not trust it enough yet to speak it plain. That evening, over the wash basin, she finally gave it voice. "Have you noticed," she asked him, "that nothing troubles ours the way it troubles his?" Franklin looked up from the harness he was mending, and for a moment neither of them said anything more, letting the question settle the way a stone settles into still water. "The bitterness," she said at last. "The same bitterness that near turned my stomach when I first smelled the mud. Perhaps it does more than color the soil." She thought of Barley's sneeze, of how even the dog had shied from the sharp tang clinging to the skin of the root, and wondered aloud whether whatever kept a curious animal at bay might keep a hungry beetle at bay as well. Franklin set down the harness slowly. "Tannin," he said, testing the word as if it were foreign to his own mouth, though he had heard it spoken often enough at the mill fence, when the tanner's men complained of the smell soaking their hands. Neither of them claimed certainty that night. It was only a suspicion, thin and unproven, resting on nothing sturdier than one field thriving beside another failing, but it was enough to send them out again the next morning with a lantern and a spade, moving row by row along the bark-darkened bank, searching not for size this time, but for absence. The absence of chewed leaves, the absence of black crawling backs, the absence of the ruin that had settled so completely over every other root crop in the valley. The lantern light moved slow along the bank that morning, and what they found there was not proof so much as the shadow of proof, a suggestion that once seen could not easily be unseen. Row after row of the bark-fed turnips stood whole and green-topped, their leaves unmarred, while a stone's throw away, in the ordinary garden bed they had planted the old way in plain black soil, the beetles had already begun their slow, patient ruin. She crouched at the border between the two, one hand in bark-darkened earth and one in the paler dirt beyond it, and said that a line so clean could not be chance. Franklin agreed, but said agreement was not evidence, and evidence was what a man needed before he changed the whole shape of his farming to chase a smell he could not yet explain. So they built the test the way they built everything else together, plainly and without waste. He turned a second bed near the spring house, ground that had never touched a drop of the tannery's runoff, ordinary soil that had given them good carrots the year before, and bad luck with beetles every year since. Into half of that bed they worked the cured bark mulch they had been gathering from the creek's edge, mixing it deep with the spade until the soil darkened and took on that same bitter, oak-heavy smell that had once turned her stomach. The other half they left untouched, plain and unadorned, planted with the same seed from the same paper packet, watered from the same bucket, given the same sun. For nearly 2 weeks they watched both halves as a mother might watch two children, set side by side, to see which would thrive. Barley took to lying at the edge of the untreated row, as though he understood there was nothing there worth guarding, while he would not set so much as a paw upon the bark-scented soil, wrinkling his nose and trotting elsewhere. And the beetles, when they came, and they came, as they always did, drifting in from the fence line and the neglected corners of the valley, settled thick and black upon the plain half of the bed, chewing lace into the young leaves within days, while the bark-fed half stood untouched, its leaves whole, its stalks upright, not a single crawling back to be found among them. Franklin knelt there a long while, turning a beetle-chewed leaf in his fingers, then walking the short distance to lift an unmarked one from the treated row, holding the two side by side as though weighing them on some invisible scale. He said nothing for a time. Then he looked up at her with an expression she had not seen on him since the day they'd first broken ground on the claim. Not triumph, not yet, but something quieter and steadier, the look of a man beginning, cautiously, to believe. That evening, after the supper dishes had been set to dry and the lantern trimmed low against the coming dark, she sat with her hands folded in her lap for a long moment before she spoke. She had been turning something over since watching the beetles turn away from the bark-fed row, some thought she could not yet name, and when it finally settled into words, she said them slowly, testing their weight. If the bark itself carried whatever it was that kept the beetles from the leaves, then perhaps it was not only the vegetables that held value, but the very soil the vegetables grew from, the dark, crumbling mulch itself, the part everyone else had thrown away or cursed as ruin. He looked at her across the lantern light without answering right away, and she could see him working the idea the way he worked a stubborn fence post, turning it, testing where it might give. Then he asked what she meant to do with such a notion, and she told him plainly, cure it, bottle it, carry it to the trading post, and see who might pay a coin for what the tannery had been pouring into the creek for 2 years, as though it were worthless. They began that very night, though neither of them said it aloud as a decision, only as a thing that needed doing. She fetched every jar left empty in the root cellar, and he cut clean burlap into sacks from what remained of the flour sacking, and together they worked by lantern light long past the hour they usually banked the fire. She sifted the richest, darkest bark mulch through a flour sieve to catch the coarse pieces, while he packed it firm into the jars, tamping it down with the flat of a spoon the way she showed him, until the glass held layers dark as strong coffee, faintly sharp with the smell of oak and creek water. Barley lay near the hearth watching them with the mild curiosity of a dog who did not understand the work but trusted it was worth doing, and Petunia lowed once from the barn as if to remind them of the hour. Neither of them minded. There was something steadying in the repetition. Sift, pack, tamp, seal, something that felt less like labor and more like faith taking a shape they could hold in their hands. By the time the lantern burned low enough to need refilling, they had a dozen jars lined along the table and 3 sacks tied at the neck, waiting by the door like patient travelers. She looked at the row of them and felt, for the first time since Whitfield's visit, that the creek bank might yet prove them right, not with words, but with something a man could hold, weigh, and carry home. The letter came folded twice, sealed with plain wax, carried by a rider who had business at the mill and thought to drop it at their gate as a courtesy. She read it twice before she understood what it asked. A man 2 counties east, an orchard owner near the river bottoms, had heard through a cousin of a cousin that a homestead along the creek was selling something that kept the beetles from a man's turnip rows. He did not care what it was made of. He cared only that his apple trees were losing their leaves to the same pests every August, and that nothing he tried, not soap water, not tobacco dust, not prayer, had done a lick of good. He asked, plainly, if she would send what she could spare, and named a price that made her sit down at the table and read the letter a third time to be certain her eyes had not tricked her. She showed it to him that evening, and he read it standing by the door with his hat still on, as though he might need to leave suddenly to make it true. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then he said quietly that a man 2 counties off did not write letters over nothing, and she said no, he did not, and they both looked at the jars lined along the table as if seeing them fresh. They sent 4 sacks and 6 jars by the same rider the following week, wrapped carefully in burlap and tied with twine, and did not let themselves hope too loudly until the coin arrived. Real coin, counted twice, more than either of them earned some months from the whole of their harvest. After that, the letters came steadier, one every few weeks through the start of winter, each one asking for more than the last. She began keeping a ledger in the back of her Bible, small, careful figures in pencil, and he began setting aside an hour most evenings, just for the sifting and packing, as though it had become as necessary as chores. Barley took to lying by the door on packing nights, watching the sacks pile up with the same patient interest he gave the woodpile. Petunia's milk went to butter they traded in town, but the jars went further than town now, further than they had ever sent anything grown or made on their own land. It was strange coin, she thought, coin made from what a mill had thrown away and an assessor had called ruin. She did not say so aloud. She only wrote the figures down and let the ledger speak for itself, growing heavier one small number at a time. When the frost finally loosened its grip on the valley, she noticed it first in the smell of the creek bank, not the sour tang of winter mud, but something warmer underneath, like tea steeped too long, rich and dark. He noticed it in the soil itself, how it crumbled instead of clumped when he turned it with the spade, how the worms had returned early, fat and busy, working through ground that neighbors still called ruined, out of old habit more than belief now. The letters kept coming, and with the letters came faces. Orchard men riding in wagons from 2 counties over, hats in hand, asking to see the creek bank for themselves. She walked them along the fence line while he stayed back near the barrels, quietly proud, watching her speak of tannin and bark like she'd studied it in some university instead of learning it barrel by barrel through a hard winter. They left with sacks tied across their saddles and promises of more coin come the next thaw. By the time the first shoots of turnip greens broke through, side by side with the greening creek grass, the 2 of them had fallen into a rhythm that felt less like labor and more like a kind of quiet conversation between their hands. He turned the beds. She measured the bark into the trenches. He hauled water up from the creek. She checked the jars curing in the cellar, tapping each lid to hear if it had sealed right. Some evenings they didn't speak much at all, just worked alongside each other until the light went gray, and then sat on the porch step with Barley between them, watching Petunia graze the near pasture, feeling the ache in their arms as something closer to gladness than tiredness. "Do you remember," she said one such evening, "when we thought the mill had ruined us?" He almost laughed, low and disbelieving, the way a man laughs at a fear that's finally shrunk small enough to hold in one hand. "I remember thinking it was the end of something," he said. "Turns out, it was only the start." She didn't answer right away, just leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, watching the last color drain from the sky over the ridge. The orders kept climbing, more sacks, more jars, more names on paper she didn't recognize, folks who'd heard of the Reyes bark from someone who'd heard it from someone else, the story traveling faster than either of them could keep pace with. And somewhere beneath all that work, beneath the counting and curing and hauling, was the quiet astonishment neither of them had quite gotten used to, that the very thing scorned as worthless had become, patiently, season by season, the truest measure of what they'd built together. Assessor Whitfield's wagon came up the rutted track on a morning thick with the smell of turned earth, and she saw him before Franklin did. The same gray hat, the same stiff posture, though something in the way he held the reins seemed less certain than it had 2 seasons before. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood at the fence line, waiting, while Barley trotted a wary circle around the wagon wheels and Petunia lifted her head from the pasture grass to watch. He climbed down slowly, older-looking somehow, though it had been less than a year. His eyes went first to the creek bank, to the rows of turnip greens spreading broad and dark, the carrot tops feathering thick along furrows that had once been called ruined, and he was quiet a long moment before he spoke. "I heard talk in 3 towns," he said, "of bark from a Wyoming creek keeping the beetles off a man's whole orchard." He turned the hat once in his hands. "I didn't credit it, thought it was the kind of story that grows taller with the telling." "It grew," she said, "but it didn't need to. The truth of it was tall enough." He walked the rows himself, crouching once to press his thumb into the dark, crumbling soil, the same soil he'd once scraped with his boot and called worthless. He said nothing for a long while, only looked at the jars stacked near the barn, the sacks waiting for the next wagon, the ledger Franklin held loosely at his side, with names from 2 counties written in neat, patient columns. "I was wrong," he said finally, plain as a man setting down a heavy load, "wrong about the land, and quick to judge what I didn't understand." He opened his own book, wetted his pencil, and wrote a number that made Franklin go still beside her, triple the figure from that first cold visit, the one that had felt, at the time, like the ground giving way beneath them. "It's not charity," Whitfield added, almost gruffly, closing the book. "It's plain arithmetic. This is the richest bottomland in the territory now, and every soul from here to the mill knows it." When his wagon had rattled back down the track, they stood together at the fence they'd built with their own hands, the creek murmuring behind them, bark dark and generous, Barley leaning warm against her leg. Franklin didn't say anything grand. He only took her hand, the way he had through every hard winter and every doubtful spring, and looked out at the land that had once shamed them and now spoke, plainly, of everything patience and faith could grow.